to care for all without reserve and spread his liberating word. Well, good evening and welcome. I'm Bishop Jerry Manschultz, and I welcome you to our program this evening, the title of which is Becoming a Vital and Vibrant Intergenerational Faith Community. It is great to see so many people who have come out for this pre-assembly evening. I think we have a terrific program for tonight and throughout the assembly, but glad you are here this evening. The theme for our assembly is being church together, feeding and equipping leaders. And what we're trying to focus upon is how we be a vibrant and a vital church together for the purpose of engaging the world out beyond the doors of the church. And we know that becoming that kind of congregation starts with our being in tune with our faith ourselves. And so we are so glad that you are here tonight. One of the things that we realize and we hear a lot about as churches, we live in days when we need to be nimble and adaptable. I always thought that meant for other people. What we discovered was that also is true for Synod staff and Synod Assembly planning teams. Most of you came this evening expecting that John Roberto would be our speaker this evening and for during our time together during the assembly. We received word a few days ago that John went in for some minor surgery that turned out to be not so minor. And he was really ordered not to travel and could not be with us. As it turns out, there's also been a death in his family. So it's probably good that he's not with us, but can be with his family. So we are thrilled that another person from Vibrant Faith, Jim Ledoux, was able to hop in the car and come over on short notice from Minnesota. And Jim is also a member of the executive staff of Vibrant Faith, and he and John Roberto do a lot of work together. Jim, just stand up a minute. We'll give you a warm welcome from East Central Wisconsin. Jim and John Roberto do a lot of work with all of the staff of Vibrant Faith, and he will be speaking here tonight and leading us through through some presentations and through our time together in the assembly. Though his expertise has been in the area of coaching and organizational development and helping congregations move their plans along from great ideas and visions about something, moving them into reality. How do you make things happen? So, Jim, we are so grateful that you're able to be with us. I also will have more introductions tomorrow, but I do want to note that the secretary of the ELCA, Reverend Chris Berger, and his wife Dee Dee are here with us from Chicago, our church-wide representatives. Please welcome the Reverend Secretary and spouse here. Great to have you here on our territory. But before we get into the presentation this evening, we're going to spend time doing what we regularly do when we gather as staff, as Synod Council, as in meetings throughout the Synod. We want to spend some time dwelling in the Word so that we listen for the voice of God. People who are here during the Synod Assembly will hear me talking about congregational vitality. And we talk about vital congregations are those congregations that nurture life-transforming relationships between individuals and God and fellow believers, and people in the community. Dwelling in the Word takes us forward in that journey as we humble ourselves under the Word of God and listen for the voice of God in Scripture and in conversations with one another. So we're going to have first a moment of silence, and then I need a volunteer number one to read the text. Let's say someone with a higher voice. There's volunteer number one with a higher voice. Now someone with a lower voice, volunteer number two. A lower voice. Where are we? We got it over there. Super. So a moment of silence. We'll read the text through once devotionally. We'll have another period of silence. Then it will be read a second time. And then your instructions are this. I'll want you to stand up and look around you and try to identify a reasonably friendly looking stranger, someone you don't know, and go up to that person and introduce yourself. And then the two of you, I want you to share, after listening to the text, what word or phrase in this text grabbed your attention, kind of stirred your imagination, and kind of why, and just share that and talk about that as you talk about what you heard with one another. And when we're all done, I will invite some responses. And what I will want you to report out is not what you said, but what you heard being said by your reasonably friendly looking stranger. So, a moment of silence, and then we will hear the word.
A reading from the Gospel of Luke, the 24th chapter. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe that all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen," and they and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
A reading from Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 35. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He said to them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women in our group astounded us. They were at the tomb this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets had declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near to the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread.
So I invite you now to find a reasonably friendly looking stranger and share with one another. First of all, introduce yourselves, but then what word or phrase captured your attention, stirred your imagination, and got you thinking more deeply about God's voice speaking to us this evening? Go do it. So, if I can break into your conversations, we would love to hear one or two or 8 or 9 of you share a few things about what you heard from your newfound friend. Who would like to share? Here we go. What did you hear from your newfound friend?
We talked, was it Judy? It was Judy, my new friend. And she mentioned something that I've always felt too, is God very often comes to us through people, but we don't get it right away. And it's almost like he's hitting you over the head, but my eyes are over here, you know? And we talked about who once said life is to be lived looking forward, but understood looking back, you know? And so often in our lives, we've been like these two guys walking, you know, and they catch fire eventually, but Jesus kind of just talks to them like you would talk to a 3-year-old, comes down to our level. He meets us where we are, but he's coming to us every day. And I think a part of it is just being so receptive, being ready, having our eyes and ears and hearts open to that. Yes, Judy?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
I spoke with Pastor Jen about this, and her comments were that it was always them, they. There was more than one. They were never alone. And that was something she had never totally realized in this story before, that there were more than one.
A lot of conversation in community. Great.
Well, I talked to my friend Peg, my new friend Peg, and we talked about on the second page here, we looked at, he took the bread, blessed it, and broke it and gave it to them. And I was thinking that we needed to be proven, just like doubting Thomas needed to have proof that this is who it was. But she said, chances are they hadn't heard about the Last Supper yet because there was no tweeting, I believe, in this day and age. So we thought, or Peg's enlightenment said that she thinks that God allowed their eyes to be opened at that point, that they didn't necessarily hear about the breaking of the bread, but that God at that point allowed their eyes to be opened, that they realized this was our Savior. So thanks, Peg.
Thank you, Connie. Let us pray. Oh God, we give you thanks for this day, for the meal that we have shared, and for you come and meet us along this journey. Open our eyes to behold your presence in your word to us and in the lives of those around us. Bless us in this time together. Be with our presenter this evening and in all things. Build us up in our life together in you, and in all that we do, may we bring glory to your name. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Please join me in welcoming once again Jim Ledoux.
We'll make sure my mic works. You can all hear me. Very good. First of all, I want to extend greetings from John Roberto. Yes, I do not look like him. I do not have his memory, but I do have his passion for helping people form faith every day, everywhere, with everyone. And John we talked on Monday as we walked through his slides and talked about this event and some of the things he hoped to share. He made it very clear that he says, I don't want you to just impart information. I want to make sure that these ideas, this information bubbles up and finds tangible ways to be implemented into people's lives and their faith communities so that it becomes transformational. So he says, that's all I'm going to ask that you do, is that every church here does something transformational because of what is shared. I said, well, John, that's quite a tall order. I'm not sure I can do that. And he says, well, you're used to cleaning up my messes. You figure it out. And so that's kind of how we left it. But I do want to lift up a critical element and maybe explain a little bit of the dynamic of with John and I. We've known each other for 20 plus years. We've worked together and been at numerous events for the last decade. And John is truly a walking encyclopedia. In fact, there's times I've called him because we also have this wonderful affinity that he gets up at 4:30 Eastern time. I get up at before 5 Central time. And we're the only two people that are texting or having phone conversations before 5:30 of our staff, because the other ones are usually texting and emailing, usually about 1 o'clock the night before. So we have this kind of interesting dynamic. But one of the things that, as we've talked about this, is John really does bring a wealth of ideas. But as we talk about transformation, ideas are good only if they get translated into some very tangible ways that make a difference in people's lives. And one of the things that Vibrant Faith has realized over the last, I'd say 5 years, has just become clearer and clearer that there's 4 things that need to happen. As we share information, first of all, there has to be this conversation that we digest it. We allow it to bubble up. We talk with one another. And one of my hopes would be throughout this weekend that maybe you're just kind of creating a list of what are some ideas that I want to think about a little bit more, allow them to kind of stir and bubble up and pray about and discern. But then to start thinking about a week or two now, what are we going to do with it? What are the implications? And then, so these ideas have to be somehow translated into a tangible plan that we live into it, where there's kind of a who's going to do what by when, if these are really good ideas. Because if we only go and this stays in our journal or wherever we're recording our notes and we don't do anything a year from now, somehow we've squandered an opportunity. So how do those ideas be translated into a plan? And then the question is, you're probably all aware, most of you probably have strategic plans or ministry plans. And most of them I know when I talk to church leaders, they're usually in their now defunct library. No one is actually using them and living into them and referring to them and building agendas and talking about them. And so the question is, then we also need accountability and conversation about what's the next step? How do we live into it? Because just because we have great ideas and just because we have a plan, there also needs to be this mutual accountability to say what's next. And how do we make sure that that happens so that there's consistent movement? But then we've also seen one other thing where we see churches that have the ideas, have found ways to translate it into something tangible to live into, and maybe even have had some accountability and a coaching. So often we need tools. What are those specific resources, ideas, those tangible things that allow us to actually to live into that next step? Because most people don't have the time to create the individual tools. So Vibrant Faith spends time addressing those 4 areas. you're going to hear a lot of ideas bubble up from what John has been researching and from his books, and I'm going to be sharing with you his slides. And then we're going to talk a little bit about ways that other congregations and individuals have lived into those. And then what are they doing now to kind of continue to extend some of their imaginations. But I also will be highlighting specific tools that helped them kind of get over the hump that made a difference in that capacity. And I also want to talk about, there's a fair amount we're going to be addressing regarding this intergenerational faith formation process. But I love the two words that are lifted up here, vital and vibrant. And we need to talk a little bit about how does that show up? And what I heard talking with Kayla a little bit about as we're digesting the passage from Luke, and this idea about eyes wide open. A piece that is truly transformative for a church is where we have the opportunity to see life and each other and Christ in our communities and our churches with new eyes, with a new angle of vision. Because if we keep seeing things the same ways that we've seen it before and don't begin to think about different approaches, different angles of visions, different perspectives, we're going to miss the boat. And I want to share with you that one thing that I've really seen that in thriving churches, they all have this characteristic. And again, a thriving congregation is really a collection of what I would say thriving individuals. People that are growing spiritually, but they also have this part here, which I think is directly connected to growing. And that is, they are curious. In fact, I would say, and this even is right out of Patrick Lencioni's book. He talks about the ideal team player. He says the ideal team players, he lifts up two areas. Is first of all, they are humble. They're not arrogant. They are open to new ideas. They want to collaborate, but they're also hungry. They're curious. They're curious about what God is up to. They're curious about what others think. They're curious. But in essence, there's a growth mindset. There's a sense of curiosity. Might there just be a better way to do ministry? Is there a way that I have something to learn from one another? And a piece I would also lift up here, I'm looking at Kimberly Stowell here, one of the pastors I've loved. By the way, she's one of those individuals. This is a source of wisdom. And maybe I want to lift this up because I think we need to be curious about what we can learn from one another. And one of those critical pieces is we need to be able to see ourselves as both a teacher and a student. And one of the gifts that Pastor Kimberly has shared with me was her practice of having a gratitude journal and how transformative that was for herself and her congregational setting. And it's something that I've actually translated to my life and found it deeply enriching, a wonderful spiritual discipline. I keep my journal on a daily basis through this digital app called Day One. And I love getting to the end of the day where I list what were the 10 bright spots? Where were the 10 moments of gratitude? Where was God present? This really becomes my gratitude journal ending the day. And what a way to be able to start strong at 4:30 in the morning and then be excited at 10 o'clock at night. And what are those capstones in our daily routines? But I want to lift that up, that part of this process, if we really want to live into becoming an intergenerational community, it must be where we're actually curious to know about one another, that we see wisdom and value and ideas from other people, that we're drawing that out, and also being willing and vulnerable to share ourselves with other people. And we need to be able to see that, in essence, our faith communities pretty much have everything they need to do good work and do ministry. And maybe another critical component of thriving congregations is that they build on their strengths and celebrate their strengths. They're not captivated, held hostage by what they're lacking. They're not held hostage by playing the role of a victim. They are solution-minded. They're looking for new ways, new pathways to do new and effective ministry. But that also means they're willing to experiment. And tied in with that, it means they're willing to move beyond fear and be willing to try some things knowing that they will fail. But understanding that failure is part of the learning process. And this is something that I think we can claim as Lutherans. We should actually be those that, from my perspective, with this bold, rich tradition, the Reformation, we should be the ones excelling, modeling the way for other faith communities about what it means to act boldly and try new things and stir things up a little bit. And sometimes we abdicate that. And we miss those opportunities to serve and bless other people. I also think we really need to pay attention to this process of making God the subject of our conversations. And I want to share with you just a brief story about a youth group I led from Minneapolis to Tennessee. This was back in the late 1980s. And we stayed at a Lutheran congregation just a little ways outside of Nashville. We attended worship there. The people were marvelous, provided great hospitality. We felt very welcomed. But one of the things we did every single day is we always had a time where we kind of did a recap at the end of the day. What did you learn? What did you observe? Where was God present? And one of the evenings, Wednesday night, we went across the street because the Baptist church was having a gathering. And so we went to their worship service and some of their educational things. And then that night we talked about it. What did you observe from our Lutheran tradition Sunday morning? What did you observe from the Baptist tradition from Wednesday night? And what can we learn from one another? And there was one sophomore student that said, one of the things I noticed, he says, I was listening because I'm kind of an introvert and I really didn't want to mix with a lot of people, but I was listening for what people were talking about. And he said in Sunday morning, most of the people were talking about golf and fishing and, lots of good things and sports and things like that. But at Wednesday night, I noticed that people were praying for each other and they were talking about their faith practices. And I said, I felt like we had something to learn from those Baptists, that we would actually be thinking about making intentionally God the subject of our conversation continuously. And so I think that's a piece that we need to be looking at, is how do we make God the subject of our conversation? How do we actually become comfortable talking about this? How do we equip and empower people of every age and life stage? And I even want to share with you a story about a woman that was, she was 79 when this came up, where she said, I realized as a great-great-grandparent that when it came to Thanksgiving prayer, I did not feel comfortable praying publicly, even with my family. And she said, I got to thinking about this, and why was I never really equipped to do that? How did I miss the boat? Why has that been so difficult? And she said, realize that there was this tradition they realized, especially at church, every time there was a table grace or a prayer to be said, well, Pastor, would you like to say the prayer? So she said, I guess I got this idea that lay people don't pray publicly. That's the pastor's job. So how did we miss that? So I think we have to be careful of both what we say and what we don't say, what we do and what we don't do, because we pay a price for that. And let me share with you another thing that's a powerful element. As we talk about forming faith at every age and life stage, we have many congregations that feel kind of beat up, saying, they're only looking at who's not here, which I'm glad they're thinking about that. But sometimes they forget to see who is here, who is growing. But so often what we hear and what we celebrate, especially I want you to think about, especially this time when there's confirmations and graduations, there's lots of stories about young people in their faith-forming process. But in most churches I go to, if I read their newsletters, their e-news, attend worship, I rarely ever hear a testimony or a sharing of a faith practice of that someone that's in their 20s or 30s or 40s or 70s. And so by simply not sharing those stories, and I know they're out there because I've heard them personally, in essence, we normalize or at least create the impression that people don't grow after they're confirmed. And so I want to share with you what came up in a church just a couple weeks ago as they were celebrating teachers about their, just all these wonderful teachers and forming faith in our children and our youth and things like that. And this woman just said, I just want you to know that, and I feel kind of bad. This is how she started out. She says, I feel kind of bad that I have denied most of the people sitting in our worship service today, denied this opportunity. And that is to teach our young people. Because she says, you know what, being a Sunday school teacher week after week, it forces me to continually pray for these young people. I'm challenged by their thinking and their idealism. It keeps me grounded in reading scripture throughout the week in preparation for Sunday. And she says, my faith in life is so much richer because I've had that privilege of being a Sunday school teacher, and I feel really bad that I've taken away that from some of you. So if I should set aside so you can do this, I will. But if you've never been a teacher in that setting, never had the opportunity to continue to pray for and encourage and read scripture and dwell in the word, you're missing the boat. She says, I want to be able to hear stories of people growing at every age and life stage. And these young people continue to remind me of how important it is to wonder what God is up to. And when we talk a little bit about calling on Saturday, this idea that our calling isn't just when we try to figure out where we go after college, but actually we have callings that we continue to need to discern at every age and life stage. We have multiple callings based on our different roles and responsibilities that God has endowed us with. How do we live more fully into that? But I want to lift up that part about thriving congregations are curious. Thriving congregations make God the subject of their conversations. Thriving congregations actually find tangible ways to practice their faith each and every day. And since I heard and enjoyed this wonderful meal, but heard about food, I'm just curious how this would be for most of your members in your congregation. Because one fellow described it saying, I feel like when I go to church on Sunday morning, I get that all-you-can-eat buffet. We got terrific music. I get communion. I have some good conversation with other people. We have some life-giving prayers. He said, I just feel like I'm on that mountaintop. He said, what I haven't been able to figure out, though, is I feast on Sunday morning, and for some reason, I've allowed myself to fast the rest of the week. How do I move beyond spiritually feasting and fasting? How do I make sure that the words we came up with, how do we become spiritual grazers? Where we're actually eating continuously, being spiritually nourished throughout the day, finding many Sabbaths, finding ways to frame our days with some scripture reading, making maybe a phone call to someone. How do we do that on a regular basis? I just want to share one other story before I start going through a few different slides. And one of those is about a woman from a Presbyterian church where I did some coaching and consulting. This woman was a shut-in, and she was rather lonely. And she just said, this is a church that has made a desire and intention. They framed it saying, we want to help people build deep connections with every people in different generations. Obviously what we're talking about here. And she says, I felt like I could do something about that. And a lot of people said, well, it must be really hard being a shut-in. And she said, well, no, I've actually found a way to do that really well as a shut-in. She says, I do get lonely. And so I asked Pastor David to give me the roster and to give me a list of the new members and to give me the list of the people they hadn't seen for a while. And she said, I just asked for permission that I could give them a call. Just said, I just want to check in with you. I haven't had a chance to meet you. Tell me a little bit about your life story. And she gradually began to build this relationship with him. And sometimes just saying, I just want you to know that this is coming up next week. And by the way, what do you do in your free time? What do you like doing? Or how did you join this church? And what drew you to this church? What would cause you to leave this church? All of a sudden, she was doing all this wonderful information gathering. And she said, then a lot of times you just say, I don't know if this is okay, but would you mind if I just prayed for you before we hung up? She had this wonderful, wonderful ministry. And one of the things that we saw, because she was also calling some people that, were there for like 2 months, new members, and then kind of dropped off. And then all of a sudden we started seeing kind of a bubble up where some of these people were coming back. And this Pastor David said, we just started asking, it's really good to see you. And so often then we kept hearing, well, so-and-so called me and just invited me and built this relationship. And all of a sudden, some of the people that probably never would have came back as recently new members were coming back because someone recognized an important relationship and sought to build it. So I want to lift up this part, and it doesn't matter, and this is even the same thing with hospitality. We have checklists galore on what every church can do at every stage, from signage to music to follow-up to welcome packets, all these things. And those things help with hospitality, but ultimately, if you really don't care about turning a stranger into a friend, we've missed the boat. And usually when we care about turning a stranger into a friend, it's because we actually are sufficiently curious about them that we want to know their life story a little bit, and we're willing to actually invite them into our life. So just know that these deep intergenerational relationships we're talking about is more than smiling and a handshake. It's actually our willingness to risk and take some time to invest in other people's hopes and dreams and yearnings, and to walk alongside them in profound ways. And how do we do that more intentionally? And I want to just ask you one question, and this is all you have to say. You can stay at your tables, but just as we get this powered up here, I just simply want you to name one person that in some way was a transforming presence in your life. And if possible, if it's even be related to a spiritual piece. Is there a role model, a mentor, someone that walked alongside you? Just simply name the one person to a person at your table. You have 90 seconds. And Will, you'll check that? Just see if that works. Oh, maybe it's just something come loose. Did I just? Mhm. Yeah, 15 more seconds. You can do it. Okay. How many of you, just a quick show of hands, could come up with a person, come up with a person right away? Okay. Now I want you to think, how many of you, and I want you to think about this, because this is a question that I used to ask people. I originally served a church, Lutheran congregation, and my first 5 years of working with that church was serving as a youth and family minister. And this was one of the exit interviews that we had for high school students. And we literally asked him, just saying, of the people in this congregation, who was it, if you had some type of challenge or needed to talk to someone, how many people could you name? And it would just be not like they have to fix it, just that they would be a person that would listen. Because one of the things that we were real intentional about in our ministry is developing a web of support, of having people of various generations connecting with our high school students. And one of the things that we found is that the first couple of years, people struggled to come up with more than one or two names. And it always was like a confirmation mentor. And by the way, we told them it can't be one of the paid staff or the pastors. Who beyond that? But we found it was really limited. But when we, over a period of 5 years, as we really began to create these webs and this network of support and encourage this web of support for young people, and also help build the congregational capacity just simply to introduce themselves more than wave hands at each other, all of a sudden people started naming a lot of different individuals. So there was something we started saying and doing church differently that led to this much more profound intergenerational faith community. And there's even a woman that I've shared with some of you that I've met about this woman named Myrtle, who, as we were developing this in the congregation, just said, you know what, I really have a passion for connecting with young people under 48 inches tall. And so what she says, and I'm 82 years old. I'm probably not too scary, but I just want to be kind of a second grandmother to all these young people. So we said, and I want to work with the young people. And so obviously, you're thinking, well, let's involve her in a Sunday school class. No. I've had enough of that. I'm a retired teacher. I just want to do it my own way. And so her own way was to literally go out into the main entrance. She'd go outside. And as she would see those people under 48 inches tall, she'd go kind of walk up to them with her. And she even had a cane at that point, just said, good morning, my name is Bertle. What is yours? And she'd get to know all these kids' names. And she had this little binder here. She'd write these notes down for the children. And then she said, I'm going to be looking for you next week. And she'd always have a Tic Tac or a gummy bear or something like that. But what we noticed afterwards, she was learning these things. Then she'd ask him, well, how was your homework assignment that was due? How did your speech go? She started asking these questions because she knew the kids. And all of a sudden we started seeing, which was kind of unusual, when people leave church, the sanctuary, so often there's a receiving line for the pastor. Well, we started getting this receiving line for all these young kids before they came into the church to greet Myrtle. And they were giving hugs and getting to know Myrtle. And we'd start hearing these stories saying, well, Dad, we can't miss worship today. Myrtle's going to be looking for me. Wouldn't we all love to have a Myrtle in our congregation? Someone looking out, paying attention to who wasn't there. She would even do that. She'd go home and write cards and just said, because she, with permission, of course, from the parents, she said, she had sent a card saying, I didn't see you this morning. I hope you're okay. Be praying for you this week. I think, if you remember John Nesbitt, if anyone can remember where they talked about mega trends, they talked about what people are, we're moving into this high-tech and high-touch society. Myrtle was that high-touch person that found tangible ways to make sure to create these wow experiences and make people feel special. And I think sometimes that's what we're missing in the churches too. These thriving congregations find ways to create wow experiences. And obviously a lot of them can be through some wonderfully designed and thoughtfully, created worship experiences and classes. But sometimes we forget about some of the other wow experiences, is really just having a significant relationship with someone that was fully present for us to hear from one another. So I want you to think about that. And how do we, in essence, unleash those people? What are those gifts, those talents, those passions where they're sufficiently curious and want to go make a difference in the lives of other people? What was interesting about Myrtle is so often we talk in leadership that, leaders have followers. I would advocate that our best leaders raise up other leaders who in turn raise up other leaders. Kind of that discipleship mindset, isn't it? Go and make disciples who in turn make disciples who in turn make disciples. Or sometimes we've said, go and find the pastor who will make disciples instead of us taking ownership for how we do that more intentionally. And so how do we equip people to do that? But I think we need to find ways where, in essence, we're creating a culture where everyone finds their sweet spot, their niche, to be a source of hope and blessing in lives of other people in various generations. And it starts where we actually get to know each other well enough to do so. And so I want to lift this up, obviously, as we walk through some of John's slides and begin thinking about this intergenerational piece. How many would say that things have changed a little bit dramatically back in the last 20 years? Church isn't done quite the same way. Yep, and I know you've all seen the pictures where, like in 2007, the Pope is out there in the St. Peter's Square, and everyone's looking up the Pope, and then you look 5 years later, and everyone's holding up their cameras. I mean, just as a reminder of how technology has really made a profound difference. And I want to lift that up, saying, I think, first of all, we need to be anticipating, because so often the church is reacting rather than being proactive. And again, thriving churches, that's what they're doing. They're not looking at just what types of programs that we should have now, but they're actually thinking 3 to 5 years from now, what do we need to start creating now when some of these things end? For example, some of you, I'm just going to switch and go to a slide that's just down a couple here. How many of you have seen the life cycle? Seen something like that? Life cycle of organizations, churches. So, I would advocate that probably every one of our churches probably has a program or a ministry that needs a funeral. There's something that we need to let go of to say it served its purpose. And I want to really lift up that idea of a funeral, because a funeral is a time where we celebrate the transforming presence of that individual and recognize the uniqueness of them. And I think so often we have programs and ministries that die a slow death, where we should actually celebrate the good work and the good ministry that took place, but to realize we're in another age and a time where maybe we need to do something differently. And so I also, as you look at that illustration with this idea, you see the circles going around, this idea of, we can find ways to end things, we can start some new things to give new birth, but there's this constant regeneration. And how does that show up in our congregations? And a question that I typically ask congregations as part of our standard kind of a intake form with a congregation is, what have you started in the last 2 years and what have you stopped? Because I can tell you it's fairly telling if there's nothing on either end. It means that in some ways we're on autopilot and we actually haven't paid close enough attention, and we're not actually tracking the impact and the reach of our ministries and exploring new ways to do things to get different results. So I think we need to pay attention to those items. I also think we need to pay attention to this too. I think with these different opportunities, and I want to lift up one from a church, they create new opportunities. There was a church in Minneapolis where they did a survey of their young parents and their children. And one of the questions that they asked in the survey is, in a given week, how many minutes do you spend commuting or driving in your car? And for this church, it was just off the charts. And one of the questions they asked in that, it was kind of a fluke question, but it was really quite profound, was, how could that time in the car be used to help you form faith and build connections with those that are riding with you? And what the church ended up doing is actually creating these little kind of talk sheets. And once a month, there would be a talk sheet that they would give to everyone, and they'd send it out in their e-news and just say, keep this in your car. When you're driving along, ask these different questions of one another, get to know each other better. And then they started putting in their toolkit. Here's some podcasts that you might want to listen to while you're driving to and from work, or picking up Susie at the soccer field, whatever it was. But they started saying this was a reality, a new learning. How are we actually, what are the implications, and how do we capitalize on that? And so, in fact, there was one person that they shared in a story that learned, he says, and he sent the note to the pastors, do you realize it takes the average person, if you buy one of those Audible things and listen to the Bible, it takes 72 hours to listen to the Bible? He said, well, I decided I'm going to use my commuting time to listen to the Bible when I'm going back and forth to work. And guess what? In just 45 days, I had a chance to listen to the entire Bible. And he talked about all the things he never knew that was in the Bible simply because he had a chance to listen to it. So I think it's those little things like that that can have a profound impact if we're paying attention to these challenges and the opportunities that come out of that. So that's a question I just want you to share one of your hopes for your congregation as it relates to forming faith intergenerationally. Share one hope at your table right now. And I'm going to give you 3 minutes now. 3 minutes to share one hope about intergenerational faith formation and maybe even intergenerational community building. Take a moment to do that. Mhm. 30 more seconds. There we go. Okay, time's up. I want to give you one assignment. And I want you, if you have a smartphone with you, hold it up for just a moment. Okay? Looks like most tables have at least one. I'm going to invite you just to share. You can do it individually, or you can pass on a hope that you have. But I want you to send a text to where it says that 612-865-0628. Send a text related to one or two of your hopes that were mentioned at your table. Send it to me right now. Six 612-865-0628. And part of the reason why I'm having you do that now, one, I would like to see that and read off a couple of them. Two, as we continue going through, we're going to walk through three specific strategies on how we can go deeper with developing this intergenerational community, this sense of vitality. And I have a feeling there might be some questions that come up as we walk through it. And I'm going to allow you to kind of raise questions you have as we walk through that. And you'll be part of the conversation, and we'll help shape that conversation if you so choose via your smartphones. Oh, yes, to better engage parents of school-age children. Yes. Intergenerational relationship building. Hope for young, solid engagement with young people. Yes. Help oh, they're starting to come in so fast I can't read them this quick. Okay, they're very good. Okay. I'm sure glad I have an unlimited data plan for texting. Okay, this is good. Okay. The one I just want to highlight, I won't catch all these, but I will take a closer look at them. One of those is to honor the promises we made at baptism. Isn't that important? In fact, I even want to raise this piece. It's one of my pet peeves. Sometimes I share it with congregations. And it's hard. I belong to a large Lutheran church named Prince of Peace in Burnsville, Minnesota. And they just had a baptism last weekend. And, you know, honestly, right now, I cannot remember the person's name. Because I know, and what I usually do is actually when we have it, I put it in my phone as part of my prayer list so I can at least pray for the person. But one of the pieces that I often like to challenge in other churches is this simple part. You know, we can't always connect with others, but in this role, as we celebrate and kind of we hold up our hands and say we're praying for them and encouraging them, I always like to say, who are the people that you're going to be in contact with this week or this month? How can you walk alongside them? Maybe this is the perfect time to send your grandson or granddaughter a faith-forming message, or to pray with them over the phone. Or maybe this is the perfect time to read the Spark Bible over the phone and pray for each other with your godchild, things like that. I think we need to find ways to actually live out our baptismal promise more intentionally. And sometimes we can't always do it for the person up there, but maybe in honor of the person that's being baptized that day, we could do it with the people that we actually walk alongside with and connect with. I've been very blessed with having in-laws that would actually do devotions with my children when they would stay there when they were young before school. And I even remember my youngest son was often called Pastor Kenton during the children's time because he always knew the stories. And he'd put his hand up and it's kind of like, so, okay, come on up, Pastor Kenton. Yep, see if you know this one. And the only difference is that my child had the Spark Bible read to them and knew most of the 166 stories that were in there, which is something that anyone can do without necessarily being a spiritual guru or a whiz on all the theology. But I just want to lift up that part. I think we need to normalize this idea. Parents, grandparents, godparents, just learn alongside with your children. In fact, there was even David Anderson. I don't know if any of you have met David Anderson. Here he has this doctorate theological degree. He is taught everywhere else. And he says he was reading stories. And he says, I even came across some people that I forgot about or didn't know about. And so this idea that we continue to learn. And maybe that's the culture. If we can just learn and wonder with people, I would be very happy for our parents and grandchildren and how we do that. So I want you to think about that, but honoring that baptismal promise. So I just invite you, as things come up, as we walk through kind of these three initiatives, feel free to send me some questions. Now I want to show you just two last slides before we actually go through these three strategies. I want to just lift this up as kind of a metaphor too, that in essence what we're seeking to create is almost like a greenhouse. Where, I think if I'm pretty close to Como Park Conservatory, and they have this wonderful, you can see it here, beautiful plants and flowers, but it's a controlled environment. And I think so often there's a lot of things that we can control that help us grow spiritual faith in the lives of people young and old. And we don't take advantage of that. So I want to name just some of those pieces that we do have an opportunity to help shape and hold closely and live into more fully. And so I go to this. I just want to lift up this. This is the Vibrant Faith logo. And it actually names the specific elements that relate to a vibrant and a generational faith community. So first of all, I want you to see in the middle there, you see the compass. Sometimes we also have a cross in there. But the idea that this starts with, in essence, how do we help people follow in the way of Jesus? How do we actually, what we say and do, how is this being Jesus-centered? How do we make sure we don't lose that? Because I remember when I began serving a congregation and I was interviewing people, said, what do you want people to be, what is this church known for in the community? And they were known for their lutefisk dinner, their #1 softball team, and their men's golf league. And I said, what would you like this congregation to be known for? And then there was some really good things that came up about service and community. But you know what? I asked about 50 people and not a single person said, I want people to have House of Prayer known as a spiritual oasis, where people can come and to experience God's presence in their life. And people would walk alongside them. And a couple people said it's kind of ironic that the name of our church is House of Prayer, and yet sometimes we don't always lift that up and recognize that that's one of our greatest gifts, is to help people practice the presence of God and to equip them to do that in their daily lives. So I want you to think about, are we centered on that? And are we inviting people to that? And then we talk about this, I heard also in the language today about the journey, this journey of faith, understanding that we are all at different places and that one size fits all faith formation does not work. But we need to find what is that next step for each and every one of us. And I just want to even see a show of hands. How many of you would agree that faith formation should be a lifelong process? Okay. How many of you feel that everyone should know, at least have a pretty good inkling of what their next step is? Because I think that's where sometimes we don't challenge people. If we understand it's a lifelong journey, we should begin to think about how do we live into that? What is that next step? Whether it's finding a deeper sense of our calling, whether it's maybe knowing Scripture a little bit better, maybe having some new ways to practice the presence of God, to find new ways to serve and bless in our community, or like that 82-year-old woman to be able to pray publicly and invite people into a conversation about who Jesus is. What is it that we want to grow? And how often do we share those pieces? There was a Methodist church I was at that I was really quite pleased about. They had on their way from the sanctuary to where they served refreshments, they actually had a listing of all these index cards and pictures of what people's next step in their faith journey was. And it wasn't something that was done in a very legalistic way like shoulds or have tos or anything like that. It was just simply, no, these are ways that people want to grow and become more like Christ each and every day and how they want to practice it. It was just energizing to see these possibilities and what people were naming. And one of the things they asked is just simply put their first name, didn't have to put their last name, and they had to put their age. And one of the things that the confirmation kids had asked said, I didn't realize all these older people were still growing in their faith because we hadn't shared the stories. But that was rather profound for them. So I want you to think about that. But this idea that how do we actually, that's one of our primary goals, is how do we walk in the way of Jesus? How do we help people understand who Jesus is in their life and model their life after Jesus? And then we talk about the circle, which is an important part of our conversation today, because we understand that a circle is this intergenerational community where, and just like sometimes Indian circles, where you can always step back, that there's always room for another person. So it's not a closed group, but it's a group that accommodates to be enlarged, and it also takes time to look back to say, who's missing from the circle? Who might we invite in? And then how do we support and encourage the people that are there? So it starts with actually having this intergenerational community. We talk about people matter. So when we talk about this community, is how do we build these web of support? How do we do that intentionally, deepen these relationships? And then we talk about the triangle, which is a little bit of perspective. It's this idea that as we talk about our faith, what it means to be the church, vibrant faith often uses kind of two different phrases. We talk about how do we help people connect with God, connect with each other, and connect to the needs of our community. Some people call that up, in, and out, or 3DM. Maybe you've seen that. And we often also talk about how do we help people gather, grow, give, and go. But there's certain elements that kind of define the uniqueness and the purpose of the church. How do we help people kind of live into that? And we've really found the idea of the connecting with God, connecting with each other, connecting to the needs of the community really helpful, because a lot of times churches really do community really well. But sometimes they're spiritually dry. And there's others that really do a good job of doing some personal devotions and pieces and do a really good job of community, but really have not cared for and connected deeply with people within the community. So the idea is that all three of these elements are really critical to having a thriving, growing church that represents a Christian community. And then we also talk about, if you see kind of the direction marker there, northeast, southwest, kind of that idea, that there's different ways that we express this. So if we understand that faith is a verb, that faith is something we live, not just simply like, but we find ways to practice the presence of God. We pray, we read scripture, we relate with one another, we serve, we celebrate together, celebrate milestones, celebrate through worship. So there's things that we say and do that allow us to live into our faith and experience God more fully and to express that faith. And then we also talk about not only do we practice our faith in those contexts, but how do we do it beyond the church? So the church is one place where we come to gather, but we know we also need to gather, we need to scatter. So how does this faith-forming process show up in our household settings? How does it show up on Facebook and our online communities? How does it show up in our local communities at work and school and other settings? This idea that there's this holistic way of practicing our faith where it takes place anywhere, anytime, with anyone. How do we do that more intentionally? So I want you to think about how that shows up. And just out of curiosity, just a quick show of hands, how many of you would say where you probably do it the best as far as places is at the church? That's where you tend to emphasize. As far as forming faith, building community, how many would say the church is where that primarily happens? And obviously, and what I want you to think about, and obviously I'm hoping that's the case because I think that's actually where it needs to be modeled. But so often if we look at budgets and we look at the amount of information that's shared, about 80% of time and money and resources go towards what happens within the congregational setting, primarily on Sunday morning and a little bit sometimes midweek. But the question is, what are we doing to resource and support the household setting? What tools, what stories, how are we equipping people to have these faith-forming conversations in their household settings and beyond? How do we do that and understand Facebook and Twitter and all those other things as being an opportunity to deepen faith? How do we use our websites not only as a place to share a little bit of what's coming up, but actually as a faith-forming portal and a place where we share some testimony and stories and different people's devotional practices? So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about. So as we talk about this intergenerational community, I've got to get to the right slide here. And I lost my, there's always one way I can fix it. I'll push the right button here. Now we're not going to cover all these. We'll come, oh, there, I just passed it, right here. I want to lift up these three elements that I want to go deeper with, this deep dive where you come away with some tangible tools of how we build this intergenerational community. So you see the word utilize intergenerational events. I tend to use the phrase that, which one did I use? Oh, I use instead utilize, improve. So I want you to think about, we all do as congregations right now, we already do intergenerational events. For the most part, worship is. We have all church picnics and barbecues. We have congregational meetings. There's a wealth of things. And so this strategy focuses, and I'm going to go deeper in these afterwards. I just want to highlight these three to begin with. But this is just, how do we do those better? How do we actually just improve it? So we already have these elements there. And then I want you to think about the next one is you see the infuse. Infuse intergenerational experiences and relationships into existing programs and activities. And many times these tend to be more specific, like age-related things. So how do you take a Sunday school class and somehow create opportunities where they can connect with parents and grandparents or other adults within the congregation? What are those strategies? We're going to go a little bit deeper there. How do we take a youth mission trip and find ways that it's more fully surrounded, supported, and prayed for, and maybe even planned with a larger population of our faith community? So this idea is that we still might have these things, but we're just very intentional about how we infuse it and enhance it and make it intentionally more intergenerational. And then this last piece about how do we connect and perhaps choose or launch a new activity that's intentionally intergenerational. But what I want to lift up is most churches, when we talk about intergenerational or cross-generational ministry or going deeper with this, the first default action step is, what else can we add? What's the new event we're going to do? And I would like to suggest that probably your most impactful and also what are your lowest hanging fruit is to pay closer attention to the first two. How do we improve what we already do, paying closer attention to the key success factors or ministry factors in that, and then how do we embed or infuse some of those intergenerational opportunities into the other activities? And what's nice about those first two, and I'm going to go deeper with each one of them, is that those are things that within 30 to 60 days, you can start seeing some tangible differences. Where that last one, as we talk about launching something new and thinking about it and discerning about it, and is this the right one, and is that the audience? Most of the time, that's anywhere from a 6 to 12-month process of launching something new. And so many times as churches, they talk about this intergenerational stuff, say, yeah, we've heard that stuff before, I haven't seen anything happen. And so my question is, why don't we do the things that are already easy to access, low-hanging fruit, but they're also transformational? Because I do want to lift up this word is, I'm not here to make people's lives busier. In fact, the phrase we often use is, how do we help people do less, but do it better, or do it in ways that's more transformational? I would advocate that our congregations probably would be better cutting 20% of their programs and ministries to create space and the opportunity to do the things that they still have on their plate to do it even better. I think we have a crisis of people so busy that we never have a chance to reflect on what we're already doing. And we have people so tapped out, they don't have the creative juices to imagine a new way of doing things. And so for some of us, one of our tasks maybe is to say, how do we lighten your load? And I'll even share with you a couple things that I think you can do, even if it's not drastically cutting things. By my own congregation, simply, they decided to bump back a lot of their fall programming till October 1st. It says, with all the schedules and things, what do we really have to start Rally Day, everything September 13th or 15th or whatever? And they don't always start things, January 4th. They might wait to January 15th, so there's a little bit more time. Maybe Lent can be a little bit more of an intentional Sabbath time. They have 2 weeks in July that they don't do programs, and the staff have 1 week of just simply Sabbath, rest, and discernment. So I think there's actually ways that we can create space that we don't always look for it without thinking we just have to cut all these programs to make space. But I think we have to create the margins in our life to be at our best and to be able to create some new things. And most of us don't have capacity to do that. So what I want to do is go deeper with each one of these areas. And I want to give you some specific examples of where this might show up. So this idea of using intergenerational events, some of these things will be, I'm going to start with some very basic ones, and then I want to go a little bit deeper. So this idea that you already have these events that are all church functions. So the first thing that I'll share with you, if you want to pick the low-hanging fruit, and if you want to be transformational right away, I think our biggest challenge is that then we need to help script the moves. And let me give you an example of that. I was served a Methodist church, and I was responsible for equipping their volunteer teams to provide high-quality events, but they're all led by lay leaders, and that most of them had not done events before. So one of the things that we did from the very get-go is we actually created an event planning sheet. Because one of the basic stuff, we'd get this, promote this event. Well, when does it start? What does it cost? Who's there? What are you trying to achieve? None of that stuff was there. We found that we had to actually create a form. If they walk through it, they would actually have a high probability that this would be a quality, impactful event. And so we continued to refine this document, but my task was we had a team, we had identified the people that had gifts and interests and passions in these certain areas of ministry. And then we'd ask them, and upon them saying yes, then we would email them the planning form, just said, give it your best shot, just walk through the sheet, and then I'm going to call you a week from now, and we're just going to kind of fill in the pieces. So don't feel like you have to have all of it. I'm sure there'll be some that you have questions, but we're going to walk through this. But after we actually went through the sheet and laid it out, I would say the quality of their events was nearly, if not as good, of anything that paid staff had done. And this church did not have that. But we, in essence, used that document to help ensure that it was a quality event. But here's a couple things I want to lift up with. The first couple of questions, because we rarely ever see this in a church. And this was a church, by the way, that used kind of the simple church movement when I talk about how do we connect with God, connect with each other, connect with the needs of the community. Those are three of their questions. And then they added one as they went deeper into intergenerational community. How are we going to build community among generations? So that first task in their planning the event is to think about these outcomes, how they're going to live into them. And I can't tell you how many congregations I go to, they plan an event, and I ask them, well, what were you hoping to achieve? What were the outcomes? What are those? I don't know. Well, we had 32 people show up, and the hot dogs were warm. So, good event. Let's do it again. Well, tell me. I'd like to know a little bit. And then at the end, there's these questions. What were the bright spots? How did you see intergenerational relationships being built? Where did people experience God's presence in this event? How did we make a difference to serving and blessing those in our community? All of a sudden, because we started with the outcomes and then we had a time to evaluate it, and then we gave them the tools to create a successful event, night and day difference in the quality and the impact of these events. So sometimes we have to script the moves. And so a lot of that low-hanging fruit is really a process of that. We had one church that decided to start with this strategy of just simply starting with, with worship. We talk about these things that are already intergenerational. They named the annual meeting. They named the barbecues. They named the talent show. So they kind of named all these church events. And then they strategized about how they were going to intentionally make those intergenerational in that process. In one church, I thought this was rather smart, just simply saying, we know that we should make church worship intergenerational every single week, but we just don't have the capacity to do that. So not at least starting. So we've decided to do is the 5th Sunday of the month, those 4 or 5 times that happen throughout the year. Well, obviously, we're going to try to do some things every single week, but we're going to be all out intergenerational on those 5th Sundays. And that worked really well for them, just saying that was a good, tangible starting point where they could go deeper. And when they had those events, they actually had an intergenerational planning team. They had an intergenerational promotion team. They had an intergenerational outreach team. And then they had an intergenerational worship leaders, which extended also into their hospitality piece. And then they also gathered, they had just installed a new monitor, and they were kind of hoping to do some video sharing. So based on a couple of their themes, they started capturing these 30-second little video clips. And, they'd make sure that there was something from a high schooler, and there was something from a college student, and there was something from someone in their 40s, and so they had this nice mix. But they started using the video piece during those fifth Sundays to capture other people's stories. And one of them just simply was simple questions of complete the sentence, a whole kind of laundry list of when are you most aware of God's presence in your life during the week? Marvelous, marvelous pieces, because their sermon at that time was practicing the presence of God. And they got all these little clips from every generation woven into that. So what I want you to think about is, how do you start in a way that's bite-sized, that's doable, where we're not already feeling like we're shaming people and we didn't accomplish it? How do we find some short-term wins, some immediate successes, and things that honor their capacity? Because I believe we should stretch churches, but not beyond where they break and they lose hope. I think, they say when you stretch leaders, someone working for an organization, you should stretch them about 105%, just a little bit beyond what they think they're comfortable, but not where they're going to snap or saying, this is it, I got to leave here. So I think the church needs to find a way to just do that slight stretching a little bit. So I want you to think about, the worship piece. Another thing that they also did, taking that element, they were very intentional. Then they had a group that would evaluate afterwards, saying, where did maybe we miss some opportunities? So when they started evaluating those fifth Sundays, it's kind of like, well, when we heard the prayers, there really wasn't much. There wasn't, this was kind of close to graduation time, but we really weren't praying for any of the graduates. Or they named some specific areas where they thought, based on the current news, things that were happening, this could have been a great time to maybe lift this up for a generation. But I want you to think, so there's this after-action kind of evaluation that was just as critical. So that's where one church took that. I want to share with you another church that did the same thing, saying, annual meetings, we've struggled every single year to have a quorum. Is there anyone here that struggled for those? Okay, usually a few of those. He said, what if we actually reframe that whole experience into something else? And so they had this was actually a Presbyterian church we were working with, and they just said, why don't we weave a couple things together? So we have the youth that want to do a spaghetti dinner. Why don't we kind of build that in? We have a couple people, that are here for just a short time. They were in college and they're home for January, their, what do they call it, J-term. And so they said, let's do kind of a little band and have some background music. And they had one person that actually was a music major. So during the dinner and everything else, she was playing this wonderful background music for people. And then they had a quartet that had sung. And then before they did some dwelling in the Word, or when they're doing the dwelling in the Word, they had some violin music just lightly playing. It was just marvelous what they were doing. And so they wove that in. And then they gave a glimpse of, it was a kind of a semi-talent show too. They had a couple things where they had one person that had joined, there's these comedy clubs, I don't know what you call them, but a person that had to put on an act. He says, all these acts I go to, they're really kind of dirty and kind of, foul. He says, I just want to provide a clean, funny act, and I'm wondering if I can practice on the congregation. So he did the stand-up comedy piece and did that. And then they also showed during that time of the annual meeting, they put together about a 9-minute video clip of slides, pictures, short little stories of all the highlights from the last year. And then they did one other piece. They captured some video footage, again, from different generations. And what are your hopes for this faith community moving into? And this was back in 2016. What do you hope for them? And it was just a wonderful piece. Just people said, if this is the way annual meetings would be, I'd be coming here every week. This was so life-giving. So that was a way that I think so often we just try to get through annual meetings rather than thinking about this being actually a time to celebrate what God has done in and through people, a time to celebrate this wonderful intergenerational community, and a time to wonder where God might be leading us the coming year. How do we do that more intentionally? And then there was another church. This is just kind of the last piece I want to give you an example, and I want to give you a little time to talk about your table here, was around mission trips. And this church moved, and I'm actually using this a little bit because they moved into doing a family-based mission trip. But this is how it transitioned, is what I want you to know. There was a youth group. They went with a group and did one of those, you've probably done group mission trips where they go and they worked on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. Had a wonderful experience. But this was as they were really starting to kind of turn the corner and say, how do we make these things more experiential? And how do we bring in the members a little bit more intentionally so they have this experience, because next year we want to do an intergenerational mission trip. And so what they did, they had a variety of different things. One, that, with the website, they would have people, and they lined up a number of people from different generations that would post on Facebook the prayers that they have for them. The children would share their God sightings and their bright spots and their learnings there. But there was this wealth of people that were responding from all different generations. And that was really well orchestrated. So the choir would always remind all the choir members, make sure you take a look. And then they were posting pictures back to the children, and the youth were sending pictures from their mission trip experience. And then every night during devotions, they had a couple different things. They actually had a short little letter where an adult would share their faith story, where they stretched themselves, where they moved kind of beyond their comfort zone for the sake of Christ, where they felt like they reached out. So they shared a short little snippet. And then when they also did their prayers, they would always pull out and have some different prayers that they would read from different people. And it would usually include a picture so they'd know who the person was, and here's the prayer from the people. And they just did some wonderful pieces like this that just all of a sudden made that trip experience so much richer. And then that really led, with this investment, they ended up doing an intergenerational trip where they did it just in southwest Minnesota, did it for a long weekend, but had 42 people of just different, all different generations. Just a wonderful testament. So how do we create that? So we have these opportunities, but I really want to lift up, it takes intentionality. It's not just something we can have it. So if we don't know who, what, where, when, some of those things don't happen. But I just want you to pause for a minute. I want to give you a chance at your table to say, what intergenerational event that you already have, how might you improve it? How might you enhance it to really create a much richer intergenerational experience? And I'll give you a few more examples after you've thought this through as well. Give you about 4 minutes. Mm-hmm. 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 Mind if I listen in to see if there's any?
Who's there? I mean, like now, for example, I got Ben Bolt, who's a high school kid, and I've just started an assisting ministry program, which I should have done. So he's an assisting minister. He teaches Sunday school. I got another junior high school gal that's teaching Sunday school. Existing programs are just getting. So we got about 3 people. You've got something on the tip.
All right. Any good ideas here?
Well, we were talking about intergenerational EES, which we're starting this year. The first time that we're going away from the heavily scripted, heavy decor that we had previous years, and going more toward more authentic, generic, like those Spark Bible stories, and starting with a meal and
Okay, good. Good.
You know, I agree with you there because this past year, being now that I became a mentor for these 8th grade boys, they've intertwined with my life so greatly, and I really have enjoyed this. That last half hour, we have either they're ready to go home and they don't care to talk anymore.
Okay. I'll draw your attention back here. Okay. Heard lots of good conversations. Had a chance to hear a number of your ideas. I want to share a couple other ones too. And I want to lift this up as well. So often we create more events without thinking about the actual part of, well, I'll give you an example of one church. So we gather all this, we did a lot of things, but sometimes we even need to script the moves as to what do we ask. And I'll share with you a game changer for a church in Dearborn, Michigan that was seeking to create a greater intergenerational connection and then also greater involvement in young people in particular, like in ushering and some of the worship pieces. So first of all, one of the things they did, and I give this fellow, this Gary, a lot of credit, but he worked with the ushers and just said, first of all, we need to rethink our role as ushers. That we need to actually seek to try to find out at least one new thing from people. And so they actually had a set of goals saying, they had this challenge where, can you learn about one new thing about one person from every generation? So what we noticed after a while, and they started videotaping a little bit of that, all of a sudden these ushers were building the relationships where you'd see the usher, if there was a little free time, just going up there and saying, hi, I'm Stan, what's your name? And all of a sudden, so they were doing that, and they were kind of having this little game of just getting to know the different people and learning things about that. They actually changed their orientation for the greeters and what they're actually hoping to do. Ushers and greeters, I'd love to show it to you when they ever finish it. But they were actually doing a videotape of, here's where we want you to stand. Here's what we want you to do. Here's some questions that we'd like you to ask when a person comes in. But they actually want to do that so that they could actually have a young person see that and then just see, here's what we're going to ask you to do too. And then they also had this default, because one of the challenges they said is, well, we would schedule the youth, but only half of them would come. So the critical thing that they did is just said, we are going to be ushers there. We're already on the schedule. We're already used to coming. But what we will do is when there's a young person or a college student or someone that would like to usher, we will step back and be their cheerleader. So we will make space for them, but at the same time, we won't be like we're setting them up. We don't have that. We don't have an usher. So we're either the usher or we're the equiper of the ushers. Or if that person's coming, then they're free to go greet a few more people. So they just become an extra usher. And the same thing with greeters. Why, you can have greeters out in the parking lot. You can have, in fact, one church that I was so impressed with, a church in New Richmond, Wisconsin, they had, it was raining one day, and there was a fellow about 80 years old that came out to my car and just said, "Could I escort you in for worship today?" And then when I got in there, there was a person probably 10 or 12 years old that said, "Hi, my name's Jordan. Welcome to First Lutheran Church. How's your day going?" Wasn't that nice? And then there was another kid, and he was in grade school, fourth and fifth grade. He just said, "We got some fresh baked muffins. Would you like one?" And then he said, "By the way, the blueberry are my favorite." And then when people left, there was a couple people, both in the hospitality time where they created space for people to linger and listen. And then they had a couple people just out in the parking lot, just said, "Thank you for coming." Or it might even be, "Seen you here a couple times. I don't think I've ever met you. My name is so-and-so." But they totally rethought their hospitality in the worship space to do that. And that's where also we had some churches during the worship piece where it just doesn't fit for them to have monitors and things like that, but they wanted to share some of the stories and make sure that all ages were represented, because they would start getting into this routine of having a question or two that would be related to the sermon or the worship theme or the scripture passage. But because they didn't have the monitors there, what they do, they'd just say, and there's some great stories about how people are living out this passage. You'll find that in the refreshment area and out in the narthex where we have our monitors. So they just found a way to work around maybe the challenges they had in putting monitors in their sanctuary space. So I think there's different ways that we can tell stories. But we also have to have really good, easy stories. When I talk about the tools, because most people really don't know what to ask. So we provide a lot of downloadable tools and resources, sentence starters. Here's 5 questions every usher should have in their back pocket. Be ready to ask a person if they're going to build a relationship. So we need to give people the tools, because we've in essence kind of lost the art of striking up conversations and helping people go deeper. And so we know we need to give people the tools to ask those questions that are helpful. So we can help you in that if that's helpful. So I want you to think about the worship experience. I want you to think about the barbecues and the dinners and the talent shows and the annual meetings. Is there anything else that's an all-church event that you have put energy into or you see as an opportunity ripe to make intergenerational? Just curious if anything came to mind in what you're talking about. Yes. And I'm going to repeat whatever you say just so I make sure everyone hears. Okay. Oh. Yep. If you heard that, they're having a picnic this Sunday, and they're going to look if they can partner a young person that's leading a game with some other adults. Yeah. And that's a really important piece. I think that's one of the best ways is to partner a person, partner up with games, partner up in serving, partner up in making something. I've seen a lot of partnering up with service projects. If you can just get a mixture. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Feed My Starving Children. I know there's some similar programs here, but sometimes they'd be intentionally looking at the different workstations being intergenerational as they're filling these meal packets, things like that. So, but what I want to lift up is this idea that as leaders, we need to be designers. We actually need to design the experiences to create these intergenerational opportunities. And this is where so often what we do is we just say we're going to have these events, but we don't actually design them to get that end result. And that's where we got to pay closer attention. So, and then I also want to lift up, I want to move on to the part about the embedding, go a little bit deeper. And how many of you, and this is maybe just a question I would have for you for Sunday school. Do any of you, just quick show of hands, do you ever bring in adults or people, let's just call them non-young people? Do you, because there's obviously different stages, we'll talk more about that tomorrow, but do you bring people in and where they share their life and faith story or something about their faith journey? Do you do that? Bring them into Sunday school or share that at Vacation Bible School? Just raise your hand if you do some of those pieces. And we've also had some where there's panel discussion. So based on these pieces where people just come in and young people get a chance to ask them some different questions. One of those profound pieces was also during confirmation. And this was a really good question. This young person, this church had a tradition where people wrote faith statements. And the young person said, so have you rewritten your faith statement now that you're 20, 30 years or so much long, however old you are, that's how he put it, said, have you looked it up? And they had marvelous conversations about how their perspectives on God had changed, how they had grown in their faith, and was really rich. And there's even a church now that is asking the parents to write their faith statement in partnership with their children writing it and having a dialogue about how it might be similar or different. So those pieces, also thinking about with confirmation and think about milestones. Are there times where I remember when my son was confirmed, my youngest son, we invited all the extended family, some people from the church, and we actually created these cards. And we just asked him, what would be a hope or prayer that you have for Kenton as he continues to grow in his faith? And what have you learned about God in the last few years? Because we also wanted to see where they were attentive to that. And then we shared these stories as they were opening up presents and having our barbecue, and it just was wonderful, these wonderful faith-related stories. So do we create tools for people maybe to have those type of conversations? And it was even one of the questions that we asked parents to share, one of those pieces, and we told them ahead of time, just saying, we're inviting your parents, here's the vows, to continue to worship, be part of this community, continue to serve. So what is your process for doing that? So if we're asking young people to do that, why aren't we asking everyone else to do the same thing? So we ask the parents to say, how are you going to continue to grow in your faith this coming year? Very telling. And what was interesting, we had one person, we actually had quite a few grandparents saying, well, I'd love to be able to share that with my grandson. Well, go for it. How do we be permission giving to provide those opportunities? So going a little bit deeper also, again, with this idea of how do we infuse these into our different activities? And what I want you to think of is going both ways. So often we think of young people that we are going to, bring in all these other adults and come to Sunday school and confirmation. Why don't we do it the other way? And why don't we also think about this? I've shared with a couple of you just individually about this Methodist church where they really struggled a little bit of this, it was kind of a us versus them, young versus old. And there was a third grade Sunday school class just said, I'm just tired of people not greeting the young people and building relationships with them here. But she turned it around. She said, after thinking about it, says, well, our third graders aren't going and reaching them either. So what they did, she had a 2-week Sunday school class on teaching the young people how to greet and introduce themselves to other people. And I remember being at that church that Sunday, and you could see the people coming down there. Their education wing was on the second floor, and they're coming down here, and they're all ready. And just as they're filtering, they're coming out. Hi, I'm Joey. What's your name? And they all had to go greet 5 people. But it was just amazing as they kind of walked through there, and they did it before worship, they did it afterwards, and then they had to talk about it in their week 3 of what their experience was. And one of the things, and I heard the recording, I was not there that time, but they talked about how they were surprised, first of all, that people were kind of taken by surprise, and then they were really pleased. And then there was a person, when they were sharing this at the council about what this person did and how it seemed like it was transforming things, this person said, that's the worst thing I've ever heard. And I thought I just didn't know where he was going. I did not know that because I was sitting in on, we're sharing kind of some changes here. He says, it's a shame, and I'm glad they did it, but it's a shame that we have to have third graders teach us how to befriend relationships. Why did we as adults not teach them? Why did we not model that way for them so that this would not even be something that the third grade class would have to learn? And I thought that was rather telling. They said, I'm ashamed. And I said, I was part of the problem, not part of the solution. I came here and connected with my friends and ignored the young people. And they opened my eyes to new ways of being an intergenerational church. And I'm not going to just hang out with those people and my golf friends on Sunday morning. I'm going to take some time to be part of this intergenerational faith forming community. So what came was what we thought was a huge red flag became actually a pivot point for that church to say, we're really invested in this. How do we do that intentionally? And then just one last piece of looking at the embedding. So we can do it in educational pieces. We can do it in mission trips. But I also want you to think about one piece that we hear time and time again, especially around young people, is that we don't believe that the adults of this church actually care about what we think, because they don't ask what we value. When we make decisions, they don't ask for our input. They don't seek to give us share power or give control. Or if something has to be done, it still has to be done their way. And I think we need to be married to our mission, but we don't need to be married to our models. We need to be open to new ways of things doing, and maybe not even done quite as well if that means we broaden the capacity of people being that can be part of this. And how do we also equip them so that they are successful too, rather than set them up for failure because we didn't actually support them, train them, whether a reader, greeter, some other capacity. But this power of voice, I think, is a missing component in most churches, is that we don't seek the shared wisdom of the different generations. And it goes both ways. But I think this is anytime we have to make decisions or are gathering information, we should be asking, how are we going to make sure that every generation is heard about these pieces? And that's part of the reason why people don't come to annual meetings, things like that. That's a perfect time. I even think of another church, and they intentionally got the youth and the young adults, but they actually created stations. And they were walking through this kind of gather, grow, give, go piece. And they took 20 minutes of their congregational meeting where they just gave each person, the groups, 5 minutes to say, what are your hopes and dreams as it relates to how we can be an intentionally intergenerational gathering community? How can we be intentional about growing in faith intergenerationally? How can we give of our time, talents, and treasures more intentionally intergenerationally? And then how do we go out and be our neighbor and serve the needs of our community more intentionally and build those neighboring relationships? By the way, that was the hardest one for them, the neighboring piece, to think about what those items were. But they came up with just a huge amount of great ideas and insights by creating these stations and having these intergenerational groups go and just shared some of their hopes and dreams. So anything come to you mind there, that idea of infusing some intergenerational dialogue and connections in events that are typically more age related? Anything come to mind for you? Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And your name is? Debbie. Debbie's raising a question about, does the technology and the texting and sometimes our smartphones, does that become a deterrent to building relationships? I can say absolutely, definitively yes. But I'll also say we use it as a scapegoat, because again, it's how we use it. Technology is not good or bad, it just is. It's a matter of how we choose to use it. And this is the part that I want to lift up. I remember it was actually my mother-in-law saying, oh, the children are always on their phones. And then there was a time where they're having dinner and saying, here you had them all face to face and you didn't ask them a single question. So you tell me what's different on this. So me, it's not the issue of whether it's virtual, digital, face to face. The question is, did we take advantage of the opportunity to build a deeper relationship? And that's where I go back to, are we sufficiently curious that we're asking each other questions? Do we want to go deeper with these relationships? One of the most profound experiences I had is I went through Gamaliel Institute out of Chicago and community building, and I had to, for 1 week, I had to track every interaction I had with a person and talk about in what ways were you a transforming presence. And what I had to say at the end is, all I can tell you is, and then how many missed opportunities did you have? and realized that the vast majority of the interactions we had with people, we, in essence, were too preoccupied other things that we, in essence, chose not to be that transforming presence. So this part about, we talk about leadership as a choice. It's where we choose to show up. I think we need to choose to show up and actually be present and build relationships with people. And I think we get lazy and complacent, and then we create these cultures where we really don't know people all that well. So I want to lift up also the power of technology. Because certainly it can be a hindrance if it's not utilized well. But I also want to say I've come to realize, and we do through Leading Well and Vibrant Faith, and a number of pastors here have been part of these coaching cohort groups. And I have to say, and I'm not going to put everyone on the spot, but I think of like Kimberly has become in many ways a dear friend because of the power of the online relationship. And we actually had a mix of both face-to-face retreating and then also the cohort process. But we did the cohort piece was sometimes it was by phone, sometimes it was by Zoom, but it was the technology piece. And I have to say, the majority of the people I know really, really well is through virtual or digital means. And I cannot imagine not having that as an option to build deeper relationships. And the thriving churches really have also realized that we need both face-to-face and digital. It's not one or the other. We really need to excel in both. And tomorrow when we do this breakout session, we're going to be covering a little bit more of that digital component. But this aspect of building community online as well as at the church and making sure that we're building community within a congregation or our households is really critical. And again, we only focus on what happens face-to-face in front of each other. How do we extend our Sunday morning experience into the rest of the week for people, virtually and otherwise? How do we extend what happens Wednesday night or a midweek program and beyond that? We need to find ways to repurpose what happens in those face-to-face encounters and extend it in some of those different platforms. Yes? Oh, yes, thank you for asking. I did not make that clear. It's just a cluster of 4 to 6 people that come together for an intentional relationship and accountability conversation on a once-a-month basis. And so there's an intentional scheduled time, but there's also a piece that's built into that also via Facebook for an online ongoing conversation too. But it's a small group of people that gather. Yeah. So, and actually, you know, there's nothing magical about it. It's really just an essence of another small group. The difference, I think, is that we meet to pray. We meet to find ways that we can live and lead well. And we're there to support and encourage and challenge one another. And we really ask a lot of really thought-provoking questions and gather the wisdom from the group. And I would hope that it would go beyond what we do for pastors, because I think everyone could benefit. But in essence, I would just say it's a very focused small group. But we call it a cohort group in that process. Thank you for asking. Yes? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. A piece that's probably important to say also in this process, we want to build community, but we also need to make sure that we build safe space, whether it's in person or online. That if certain things are shared that we know is confidential, that can't be shared beyond the group. That we actually are respectful of difference of opinions, that we agree to disagree agreeably, that we create the appropriate platform where people can be vulnerable. Because obviously if we destroy the trust, destroy the confidentiality, and if we're not building up the body of Christ, we have to have some pretty clear guidelines to make sure that this is a safe space for people. But then it can be powerful. So I want to move on to the third piece, and I want to reiterate this. Do you remember what the first one was? What the word was? Utilize, improve, But the idea is that we take the things that are already all church type of events. And by the way, I want to lift that up too. We have a lot of churches, if you advertise it as an intergenerational event, a lot of people don't show up for it. And my feeling is, why bother to lift that up? I would lift up from a church that we are an intergenerational faith community that support and encourage and pray for one another. But I would just call them all church events, because there's some baggage for people that intergenerational or cross-generational just is not helpful. Some check out. So I'd rather be sneaky or under the radar. Let's just have it and make it intergenerational. And I hope they never know, but they also come back and say, hey, I never knew so-and-so before. Or I had a really good conversation with so-and-so. Or I was serving with so-and-so. And I'll give you even one example of a golf group. We had a golf group, and this was a little bit more intentional, but we had intergenerational golf leagues. So every Tuesday night, the group would go out, and they would group with have a different foursome, and they would have a person usually from middle school or high school, then they have a person kind of 20s to about 40s, and then they had a person kind of empty nester age, and then they usually had a senior citizen. But they had this group of 4 that would go out, and then they would have a question per hole to ask each other. Just when they got up there to the putting, and they're just kind of simple questions. But after and this was just a short one where they did 9 holes, but it was amazing how that 9 holes of asking questions that they never would have gotten around to it really profoundly changed the dynamics. So that's where sometimes those small things can have big effects, and we need to pay attention to that. Okay, so we've done the utilize, we've done the infuse, and lots of different ways to infuse. And now this idea of, well, maybe we just want to create a couple very intentional components that intergenerational right from the get-go. What's probably the most common one for a lot of churches is just intergenerational mission trips. Do any of you do any of those or considering those? A couple churches here. Yep. And what I want you to think about right from the get-go is, and sometimes we have a lot of where those intergenerational worship services, but I want you to think about, how do we make everything intergenerational? So it's an intergenerational planning team. There's an intergenerational, again, promotion team, something like that. There might be an intergenerational logistics team. And then there's obviously, and then when you do the service projects, how are we mixing people up? And then sometimes we've even had an intergenerational communications team as far as when they go out there and they're posting things or sending stuff. We have different people dialoguing, what are we going to post on Facebook for the different groups? And so this idea that right from the get-go, we are making the whole event intergenerational. But I want to share with you that it's really hard to call something an intergenerational event if it's planned primarily either by people under 20 or people over 50. It's just kind of like, if we're not planning it jointly, it's probably going to be reflected in what the outcome is at the end. And that's so often when people don't do that. They have 2 or 3 people that plan it, usually just one generation, and they think that these would be nice things for others. And I shared with one woman that just said, well, I don't know why you're opposed to this. We called the youth and told them that they could run the dishwasher for our dinner. And I said, did you ever ask them where they would like to plug in, what gift or offer that they would have? I said, in essence, you kind of just said, well, we're looking for slave labor, and we thought we'd start on the lowest rung. Would you like to help us out so we can make this an intergenerational event? It did not go well. So I think we need to say, whatever we do has to be lifting up a person's sense of calling, their giftedness, their passion. And I would advocate that's another critical element of thriving congregations. They allow people to serve out of their giftedness and out of their strengths. And they're there to fulfill a calling, not to fulfill a slot. And we struggle when we try to fill slots, and we don't want to do it intergenerationally that way either. Which also means, goes back to that part, and how well do we know people? And one of the tools that we've often used is called, how has God shaped you? I used to use it in a congregation where I interviewed every kind of newcomer and also new members. And after 30 to 45 minutes of asking questions, I didn't need a time and talent sheet, because I knew the person, their hopes and dreams and their strengths and things. I just knew that, hey, this is a person that really has a gift of hospitality. She's been part of a culinary school. She would love to have an intergenerational group that would come over 1 Tuesday night a month and just make an Italian dinner and have some conversation. And there was another person that was a wine sommelier and just wanted to do some different pieces there. It's just kind of like, how do we honor people's passions? Because I think we should actually do away with time and talent sheets, and we should call them like to sheets or get to sheets. We have to move beyond the got to and get to the get to. How do we invite people into ministry? But for the most part, we fill slots because we don't know people well enough. If we actually knew them well enough, there'd be no shortage of ways that they would plug in at and beyond the church too. I think that's really critical. And that's another piece I want to lift up from an infusing. How often do we ask or interview people young and old where they say serve beyond the church? How do we learn how that speaks to their sense of call or vocation or honors their giftedness? How do we learn how that made a difference and how they were a transforming presence? There's a wealth of stories to be told of every generation where people are serving, I'll call it silently or secretly, because we've never bothered to measure it. Because we only measure typically what happens in the church or what we sponsor, and we're not capturing those stories elsewhere. So I want to lift up that part. But so the mission trips is an important piece. And a lot of churches also start with one that's a little bit closer to home, something that could be done a weekend or a long weekend. Some of my favorite intergenerational mission trips were actually sponsored through Lutheran Disaster Relief. Brought an intergenerational group when the Red River flooded in northwestern Minnesota. Came to Siren, Wisconsin, and brought a group for a weekend after the tornado. When they had flooding in St. Peter, Minnesota, down by Gustavus Adolphus College, went down there. One of my funniest stories there is that we had a person that was so quiet, and this was just at the time that they were coming out with, I think it's the Halloween 13 movies and what all, and was it Freddy that had the mask or whatever? Sorry, I'm not good memory there. But this introverted, about 50-year-old decided to go put on a mask, and when we were actually staying overnight in a prison, and his head would just pop up. We were playing cards and different things with the young people, and then all of a sudden you'd see this mask, and then he would move really quick. And people were just scared to dickens, and then afterwards they found out who he was. But he turned about this person who was really quiet. Everyone, he was just this beloved person that everyone loved, doing his work, and they didn't see this side of him before, and just thoroughly enjoyed it. But that was just one of the ones I savored. But what's so nice about it, Lutheran Disaster Relief just did such a commendable job of organizing it. Really, the people young and old could just pitch in and also build relationships without worrying about all the logistics. It just was a marvelous experience. If you haven't done that, that might be a good place to start intergenerationally. So is there anything else, just questions you might have about where could you start or would this work? I want to give as we're kind of winding down a little bit, give you a chance to maybe raise some of the questions you might have. And that is, again, with the idea of the low-hanging fruit, think about what can we improve, what can we embed, but also what might we choose to create something new as well. Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's universal. And obviously, I always call it, the apple doesn't fall from far from the tree. It's the adults model this life of busyness and want it for our kids, and then we complain about it. And it's easy to get sucked up into that too. But what I want to also lift up is, and again, I want to operate from this idea of that we know that's a reality. And obviously there's something, in fact, I think the church actually talks too little about how do we help people create margins? How do we say no? How do we actually people honor the Sabbath? Even if for myself, I'm a big fan of, I have multiple mini Sabbaths throughout the day. I don't really do Sabbath as a day piece just because these mini Sabbaths really are life-giving. So we all need to find our niche, but we need to have these Sabbath moments to be refreshed and reset, to be reminded that we're children of God and to be Jesus-centered. I think the idea that we live a balanced life is a myth. But I'm more concerned that people live a Jesus-centered life than a necessarily a balanced life where everything's all equal. So, and even when you talk about strategic planning, in essence, what we're saying, we're intentionally emphasizing some things and de-emphasizing others because we say this is important. So the question I would have is, even in those minimal moments, how can we bring people back to wondering what God is up to? And what I usually share with parents and grandparents is, what can you do in less than 5 minutes that's fun, that's life-giving, and that's faith-forming? And this is where, for example, my favorite time, and I may be the best to just give a couple examples of my life where I've invited other people to look at this, but I loved giving my oldest son rides from our home to Eastview High School when he's going to play soccer. Because I had that 12 minutes of drive time from my home to the school to ask how the day went, had those questions. And by the way, I was kind of sneaky. I put all my questions on my smartphone, so I just look at one. Well, Brett, what do you think about such and such? And my goal was to ask him just one question nonchalantly every single time we went to a different place. What do you think about this? Oh, I just was reading this article. What do you think we'd do? Do they ever talk about this at school? So I think, that to me, what I named and what I try to encourage all ourselves is, how do we name that as that's a golden opportunity? How do we make sure we don't miss that? That's also why I take an annual trip with each of my sons, a separate father-son trip, because I want that drive time where I just have that special experience I can create once a year in that setting. So I wanted you to think about that. How about the same thing for devotions? When people just said, I don't know what to do for devotions. This is my standard piece. This is what my family's been doing for probably 15 years. And we do it a little bit different. We have our lectionary readings. We read the gospel lesson for the upcoming Sunday. That's partly why my son was called Pastor Kenton. Not only did he have the Spark Bible that my in-laws read to them, but also we had read, the lectionary reading, the gospel lesson, and we just chose one. Didn't think we're not going to do the whole thing. There's a great resource by David Anderson, Milestones Ministry, called Taking Faith Home. We just picked that up, and there was usually a table prayer, and you might also be familiar with Faith 5. We did Faith 3. We didn't do all of them. We just did Faith 3. So we'd read scripture, we'd say a table prayer, and we'd kind of do highs and lows of the day. Very easy. And again, reading scripture, what's the lectionary reading? We read that. So now we're all really well prepared to hear the passage, and usually the message was related to the gospel lesson. So it was just powerful. But we make it so difficult, and it doesn't have to be. But again, it's a matter of, so often we talk about coaching, is how do we introduce it to people? So I remember sitting at one time, and I think the father was thinking he was going to impress me. He knew, because we had this speech, and he invited me over for dinner with it. Well, guys, we got to do this. And it got to be, well, okay, this sounds like an obligation. Again, this idea, if it's a got to, they're not going to do it. But how do you make it just something that's life-giving? So, and so I started, when we did the lectionary reading, I just said, we just said, what's the one word, one or two words that pops out of this piece? And then we would end up kind of creating a word for the week based on the lectionary reading. And that was just really simple. And then the question that was really fun then after the sermon, because most of the time the pastor preached on it, was kind of like, how do we live into this? So it kind of continued that conversation afterwards. And then we would try on some of these different table prayers that were in this Taking Faith Home piece. Also, another piece that I use, and for some of us with Leading Well, we use the daily text. So we have our Leading Well team. Every time we gather in our remote areas across the country, we all light a Christ candle, and we read and do Lectio Divina using our daily text and connect with each other before we talk about our plans for our Leading Well retreat coming up in November, in January. So I think it's just building it, but there's something magical I found. Just if we can do it in less than 5 minutes, people can usually find the time. And then there's usually different ways you introduce it, and just, you might need to tweak it a little bit. The other part that I encourage people is this try-on mindset. Well, try it for a month, or try it for a couple weeks, whatever it is. If it doesn't work for you, try another one. But this is the part I want to lift up also. And this can be a challenge, because we'll go deeper with some of our conversations tomorrow and Saturday. There's no shortage, and again, John being this aware of this encyclopedic information, no shortage of all the different ways you can do it. But it can be just like going to the grocery store and trying to pick out a tube of toothpaste, and you got 198 different varieties. Where we have that many, it's just kind of like, oh, my brain can't take that. I guess I'm just not going to brush my teeth tonight because I can't figure out my toothpaste. So I think we actually do better where we actually limit the choices. I'd much rather have a church, just simply saying, if you as a parent can do faith 3 or faith 5 and kind of build into a daily routine, and if you do it 3 times a week versus every week, hey, that's 3 times more than you're doing it before. So let's celebrate what is rather than what isn't. And then if I can have them in the course of the time that, by the time the child gets to first grade, that they've read the 166 stories and could actually say the Lord's Prayer together, I'd say, well, those are pretty good faith-forming outcomes. And none of us needed to be experts how to teach that. So those are some main things. But I just think, let's think about, and even this is the new thing too. Churches now, we're actually doing away with the bulk of our webinars after June. We're all going into 3 to 5 minute micro lectures because that's what business is doing. We all have this short attention span. That's what YouTube does. And I just think we need to say we have an opportunity of 3 to 5 minutes to make a profound difference. How do we create a wow experience that's accessible for every generation and give people the tools to do that? The other part I want to lift up is it's a lot easier actually if you created a YouTube clip of a family doing something like that or just sharing what they do, even if it's not the direct example. But most people will watch the YouTube clip rather than reading a sheet of paper. So just know, 90% of, what do they say? Most information people get by smartphones now is like 2/3 or 70% of that is video now. And I think our learnings and introductions to faith-forming processes has to go video with some examples too. Other questions you might have? Did you have another question? Oh, okay. Okay. I want to give you just one thing I just want you to add to your table, and then I'm going to give you kind of a top 5 kind of wrap up, and then we're done for the evening. Is that okay? That'll go pretty quick. But this is what I want you to do at the table. I just want you, what has maybe sparked your interest, or what is stirring maybe from our conversation tonight? Is it scripting the moves? Is it infusing something, improving? What is there just something that maybe sparked your imagination saying, this might be a place to start or consider going deeper? Just take a moment at your table and talk about that. Mm-hmm. Can you hear me now? Just a quick show of hands. How many of you, there's something that was said or shared at your table or up front or in dwelling in the Word? Is there something that you come away with, maybe one idea that might possibly be applicable to your ministry setting, either your life or ministry setting? Is there anything that comes to mind for you? Just did something spark an interest? So just raise a hand. I'm not going to call on you, so you don't have to worry about that. Because we have too many hands to call on that. Very good, very good. So, yeah. A couple of things that I want to, first of all, just share with you a couple ideas. Between now and certainly throughout the week, there'll be a couple other things we raise. This is a tremendous resource here. I tried to just give you a little taste of it. No, we can't cover everything, but there's no shortage of ideas. I strongly want to encourage you to walk through this and think about what are the implications of this. And obviously there'll be a similar one for adult education that we'll do during a breakout session and post that for those that aren't part of that breakout session too. But a couple things I just want to lift up that I think are really critical. First of all, again, this idea that if you have these ideas, where are you going to park them? So that you can actually go back a week or two later or whatever and just kind of say, is this idea ripe for something we're going to do with it? And then maybe how do you continue conversation? If you came as a team, it would be, we have a lot of churches that sometimes will schedule a time, 2 weeks down the road and say, let's just kind of compare our notes and write up one report and say, here's a couple learnings we have where we think we could go deeper or might be some logical next steps for our faith community. But so often what happens is we do this, we rush, we do this, and we don't actually have a plan for coming together and just say, let's write up something that could go in the newsletter and maybe say, here's 3 recommendations where we could see ourselves starting. I also want to lift up this really critical piece, and I'll mention it probably a time or two tomorrow because it's so critical. So often people have these ideas, and if you share everything, people are going to feel overwhelmed. One of the biggest challenges you have with strategic planning is that people share everything and their eyes glaze over. And I would advocate living into this intentional faith-forming process. It really is a 5 to 7 year process if you're to do every single one of those pieces. And obviously then you just start over because there's no new technology, new approaches, etc. But we're really having success with congregations just say, this is the year of us, finding ways to pray, helping households pray, mealtime, whatever. So it's a year of prayer, or this is a year of scripture reading, or this is a year of storytelling. That's been a really popular one for a lot of churches. But we've had many churches that have actually laid out a 3 to 5 year plan and have an annual theme. Not that other things won't be covered, but the fact of the matter is we just can't manage all these pieces and all these loose ends. And it's as much a concern of what people can get. Otherwise, we share it all out there, no one remembers anything. But we're really finding success saying, this is our theme where we're really going deep with this one, and next year we're going to address this one. So we don't lose these other ideas, but we just really be intentional and kind of laser focused on one key area of ministry. So we had one church that kind of, when I shared with some of those basic elements of that ecosystem or the culture, saying this is the year that we're going to actually focus on connecting with people, deepening these relationships, building these relationships, talking storytelling. Because we know if we don't actually find ways and enhance our capacity to have caring conversations, we can't move on to the other pieces. So they created a strategic plan, but they started year 1 was just a year of connecting. My home congregation has a theme of call to connect. So one of the years is connecting, very intentional faith practices, connecting with God. And next year, it's that connecting with one another, building this intergenerational community. And the third year is just some very tangible ways we seek to live into connecting more intentionally as neighbors in our community. And I truly mean neighbors, learning the 12 people in our neighborhood and actually know them by name and know what's going on with them. Because so often, if the church is going to grow, it's because we are actually inviting people into our life, which means we're inviting them into our faith communities. And but most of us don't know the neighbors 3-4 rows down, and we need to find ways to neighbor more intentionally. So I want to lift that up. I also want to share a couple other things. And again, even in themes, there was a church, Lord of Life in Fairfax, Virginia, that did the story, if you're familiar with that, kind of that paraphrase version, walking through the pieces. But they did a 32-week sermon series and story piece but they had, household conversations. It was part of their confirmation curriculum, and they had small groups on it. So they took one book and kind of made this a year of biblical literacy, kind of used that to help frame some things, and that was really, really successful for them. The other thing that they did, going back to this toothpaste mindset, this was a church that really lifted up intergenerationally the marks of discipleship. These 6 different marks of pray daily, worship weekly, relate with one another, serve at and beyond, give generously, serve beyond. Serve boldly is the word they used. But just they took these and then found ways to, how does that permeate? So we're all talking about this in everything that we do. So the choir, when the choir practiced, they would talk about the same theme that we lifted up the staff meeting that the council actually talked about. So they would have these kind of monthly pieces and these talking points. How does every meeting, every event somehow lift up this key concept? And so the reason I lift that up is most of this stuff it doesn't catch traction till we actually pay attention to what are the communication platforms we have, and how are we aligning our conversations and our communication with these things that we say are important. If we're doing this and we never tell a story about it, or we want people to grow and we're not giving them the how-tos, and even I look at the newsletters, I get about 50 of them a month from different churches. And most of them rarely ever have something about, here's a new faith practice to try, or here's another way that people are sharing their stories. I think our communications are underutilized assets for actually communicating the things that matter most, because we haven't thought about our platforms and our messages as being strategic in helping move this along. So really think about that communication piece. And then just a couple last things I want you to think about too. Again, I really, a lot of this, if we're going to create some margins and space, we really need to also create a culture of ongoing, what we call inspection, improvement, and innovation. I just think we need to say, is this still worthy of us doing it? So, and if it's not, we need to find a way that we can build the capacity to do some reimagining. So I think part of this assumes that you're going to do some ongoing evaluation so you can let go of some things to have time to embrace something new. So, and then the last piece I want to lift up, it is just kind of again, an idea. I don't know if any of you know a fellow or a pastor by the name of Martin Hallam. He's from the Northwestern Synod. I forget which church, but this is a piece that they had a lot of fun with this. They created, during the worship service, and again, it was part of the Reformation experience, where they actually kind of created on their monitor screens, kind of before and after the worship service and out in the fellowship area, they kind of like, it's kind of like you go to Caribou and they ask you a trivia question. They had all these trivia questions about being Lutheran and, the Reformation, and people were getting so into it, and guessing on this stuff, and it was sparking these conversations with the families. Just kind of became this runaway hit for them. So then but they started doing these monthly themes, and it's just kind of this, and what they end up hearing is senior citizens saying, I never knew that you started this for the confirmation kids and their parents, and that we could all benefit from it. And you're right, I'm learning stuff I never got in confirmation. So I didn't know that about Luther. I didn't know that was in the Bible, all these things. So then there would be pieces then they would touch on and say, next month we're going to talk a little bit about this. But they actually created a little bit of their screens and in this quiz format to really draw attention and to focus some great conversations and build up this lifelong learning process. So we now have some churches that are thinking, what are those tools? And one church has even mapped out every single month where they're going through even simple things of, we change church seasons. Do we actually give people maybe a handout, highlight something, and just say, and have families talk about that season's piece, and maybe a few questions? What's the uniqueness of Lent or Pentecost and things like that? We do a great job of celebrating Pentecost, but do we actually have some conversations that a family or household can talk about when they go home with that? So what are some of those pieces? We just need to think about how do we extend everything we do into our different platforms in different settings. But be creative. Be willing to try a couple things. The last two things I want to share with you is obviously for those of you that might be, and how many are here just for this evening? Okay. And I want you to know that John and I do this. Probably do it more because of overseeing coaching. But we know sometimes when we spark the interest, there's some ideas, and there's going to be some things that you want to follow up afterwards. So one thing I want to invite you to do, I'm just going to go right to the very front here. You'll see some previews for a couple tomorrow. Whoop, I just blew it. Getting close. Whoop, I just blew it again. There we go. I want to let you know that if there's things that came out of tonight that you just want to have a 10, 15-minute conversation, feel free to call or text me at that cell phone number if you'd like. And also know that when we do training events, and I should say I do this just simply because I'm the follow-up coach, John doesn't do the coaching, but if there's something that sparked your imagination, we offer 30-minute just complimentary coaching pieces to kind of pick up on this because we really want people to do things with it. So you're more than welcome to call and just say, I got a couple of people from church and we'd like to talk a little bit more about this infusing piece. Could we set up a 30-minute conversation? Any of you are welcome to do that. And just know that we're now moving into a time where we've got a little time to the summer to do that, but just know that that's kind of an open invitation if you'd like to go deeper with some of these pieces. And I also want you to know lifelong faith, and it's in your packet. That last page, there's some things, just a wealth of resources. This is just the starting to scratch the surface on those pieces. But on John Roberto's lifelong faith, there's a wealth of ideas and insights, and also examples of other church websites of what they might be doing that way too. So, my final word to you, breathe deeply, and I want you to say, I am sufficient. I am sufficient. And the reason I want you to say that is I want you to know, first of all, we don't have all the answers. In fact, I hope that you have more questions than you have answers, quite frankly. But I also want to lift up that part about it's sufficient. We know enough about how to form faith and build intergenerational relationships that we have sufficient knowledge, capacity to be a transforming presence right away. I just want to say, run with where God is leading you. If there's something you're passionate about, saying, this is my connection, whether it's directly connected to the church or not, but where's God leading you to go deeper with this piece? And know that you're sufficient. Because I think so often we don't feel like we're good enough or we need more training. That's one of the primary reasons we hear why parents or others don't want to be teachers, because they feel like they have to be experts. But if they can learn along with the kids, they will do that. If they can say, I'm not a perfect parent, I'm not a perfect faith mentor, but as long as I'm growing in my relationship with Jesus and I'm seeking to go deeper, I can invite my kids into that conversation too. So simply know that as a child of God, you're sufficient, and God will use you in powerful ways if you simply choose to take advantage of those many gifts and passions you have. Be well this evening.
I'm the one who had to press the button. So, thank you, Jim, for the presentation this evening. You have stirred our imaginations, got our creative juices flowing, and gave us a word of encouragement as we continue on this journey and explore new ways of forming faith among us and for generations to come. I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight, but especially those of you who are not going to be with us for the next 2 days for our Synod Assembly. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I hope that what has been shared this evening will bear much fruit in our congregations and all across the Synod. As I was thinking about much of what you shared about working with youth and having conversations, and one of the questions I wrote down was how that might inform some of the strategies that we are talking about for working with youth and young adults in a synod-wide strategy for faith and faith formation. A word to, yes, and my wife told me to be sure to write that down, which I did. Please leave your name tags. Those of you, leave them outside, yeah, outside of the, on one of the tables out there, voting members who will be here will receive new name tags for the for our time together with the assembly. The registration desk opens at 7:15 in the morning. Our opening worship for the assembly is at 9 o'clock. The Lord be with you. Gracious God, we give you thanks for this day, especially for the good we were permitted to give and to receive. The day is now past, and we commit it to you. We entrust to you the night. We rest securely, for you are our help, and you neither slumber nor sleep. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord, we pray. Amen.